So again, welcome to the Urban Transportation Center and RTA Forum. We are going to get started in just 1 minute. My name is Tina Fassett-Smith. I'm the Director of Communications at the RTA. In the chat, please share your name, pronouns, organization. Tell us how your relationship to transit may have changed over the course of the pandemic. I am going to go through some kind of just housekeeping before we get started. So I want to welcome you all here. We're really happy that you joined us. A few technical notes. We're going to ask all attendees to keep their cameras off and microphones muted. And for our speakers and panelists to keep their cameras on throughout the panel discussion. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the chat and direct your comments to Melissa Meyer, who's a member of the RTA staff. She and Lyndon Balicenti of Daylight, who have been supporting us in putting on this forum, will be sharing some useful info in the chat today. So please keep an eye out for that. We hope it's a good conversation in there. We are using captioning services today, so please take advantage of that if it's useful. Let us know if you need any help with that or further instruction. If you'd like to see just the speakers today instead of a gallery view, you can switch to speaker view, or you can view only those with cameras on. Put a note in the chat if you need further instruction on how to do that, and we will provide that. We do look forward to your questions and input at the end of our panel discussion today. So if you have Sorry, I got muted. Can you hear me okay? Okay, hopefully you can. Please place your questions in the chat for our Q&A. And we won't have time probably for all of the questions, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. And since we know we'll have an active chat today, our staff will be collecting those questions and providing them to our moderator. So don't worry about them getting lost. So before we get started, I just want to say welcome again to anybody who's just joining. We appreciate you keeping your cameras off and keeping yourself muted through the discussion today. And before we begin, I want to take just a moment to recognize and express gratitude to our veterans and service members. I'm the daughter of a Vietnam veteran and want to just take a moment to recognize Veterans Day. Second, I want to invite everyone to return for the final presentation of the semester in the Urban Transportation Center seminar series entitled COVID-19 Pandemic Impacts on Metro Operations. This seminar will feature Christopher Cracker, who I believe is a guest today, Chief Engineering Officer from Metra. He'll be discussing how the rail system has managed in the months since the pandemic outbreak and what's ahead for passengers. So please visit the UTC website to register for that. We're going to kick things off with some welcome remarks from my boss and the Executive Director of the Regional Transportation Authority, Leanne Redden. For those of you who don't know, the RTA is charged with oversight, funding, and planning for the 6-county regional transportation system, which includes the CTA, Metra, and PACE. Leanne has led the RTA for 7 years, and prior to that, directed its planning division. She was also the Director of Planning at the Illinois Tollway, and so she brings a unique perspective and has had a singular view for the last 20 months as the transit system has experienced the largest and longest disruption in its history. So I will turn it over to Leanne.
Thank you, Tina, for those kind remarks and introduction. But as we get going here, I want to thank the Urban Transportation Center and the University of Illinois Chicago for hosting this discussion. Timing could not be better for us with the work that we are currently underway with and where we plan to go and the work we have in front of us. I also want to thank the panelists and the attendees for joining us, and your passion, your commitment to the public transportation system. Someone recently asked me, from my vantage point and point of responsibility that I have, overseeing and coordinating with the second largest transit system in the country, what kept me up at night in those early days of COVID. And, I had to actually sort of stop and think for a few minutes, but I think largely it was the uncertainty. That very much coupled with the fact that we had operators, transit operators, that were still working incredibly hard, despite the risks, the health risks to themselves and their own families, and then all the uncertainties and the challenges, the operational challenges that all of that brought with it. Around the pandemic, through those early times, it was really tough. And they were there to provide that essential service really across the entire region to those who needed it most. PACE's executive director, Rocky Donoghue, has often rightly said it truly was a case of heroes moving heroes. And though personally, I was also concerned about money. Early signs were that the economy was shutting down, and that frightened me, to be frank. And I really didn't know if, and how we were going to have the money to keep transit going. Would we be able to have the funds to actually support that, lifeline and life-giving service for so many? Even for those of us who had the benefit or the ability to stay home and work remotely, but, servicing schools and hospitals and grocery stores, all of that. It was just a scary, scary, dark time. And in, I think, those early dark days, some of the innovations might have been small, but I think they were super meaningful. Also showed resiliency and commitment, I think, of the transit system and their actual operators. Metra's executive director, Jim Dewinski, tells stories about guys bringing in steam cleaners and cleaning supplies, from their homes so they could clean the trains. And, I think all three operators really created use that was the foundation of sort of this culture of COVID prevention that they, formalized and built upon and grew with. Rocky Donoghue also talks about how their bus drivers on their own dime went out and bought shower curtains initially to place them around to protect drivers in the buses in those very early days. People were pivoting, finding ways to come up with solutions, testing things, and being, innovative in large and small ways. In those early days, I also saw innovation and collaboration nationally and internationally. Personally, I and several of our staff were involved in conversations with other transit industries across the country and the world, coming together as management, bringing frontline workers together so we could share ideas, things that were working, things that weren't working, build upon that, and really help to kind of keep the transit systems both operational and safe for both the workers and the riding public. The task before us, is to grow this spirit of innovation, I think, and bring, longer lasting change to the transit system. And because of last week's passage of what is an absolutely historic infrastructure bill, I think we have even more ability to take on some of the big challenges before us. And it is historic. The federal government, could have looked at what is happening across ridership, which is, in my mind, not the most important metric in the transit system, but looked at what was happening on ridership across the country and maybe decided to sort of pull back from it somewhat. But instead, from my perspective, they doubled down and continued to show the commitment to public transportation, to the transit systems across the country, with what is the largest investment in the history of our transit system. And, as I think about this, and I just was at the APTA, the American Public Transit Association annual conference, and we have not met in several years. So inspired, a little invigorated from that, but, thinking about why we need to make this investment. And I think it's because we understand that transit really is the great equalizer, and that transit is really an irreplaceable piece of our mobility system that contributes both economically and environmentally, and enables opportunities in ways and at a scale that really nothing else can. And I think that that's an important tenet and perspective for us to carry going forward. And that's why I'm excited to kick off this panel discussion today, because we have just begun our work on our strategic plan, and our discussions like the one we're going to have today are going to be vital in help shaping it. So if we can bring up the next slide, that would be helpful. Thank you. This chart shows our timeline for our strategic plan work and the tracks that we are working on as we go through this. We will have a 10-year financial plan that will proactively prepare the region and decision makers to ensure that our public transit system is sustainable after the federal relief dollars are gone. And it will also ensure that the viability of any future planning, vision, policy, or strategy be evaluated through the lens of both financial practicality as well as attainability. The strategic planning track will, I think, help us reimagine our regional system and how it could and should evolve over the next 5 to 10 years. So in this track, I think careful analysis, large and small scale discussions like we're having today will really help us identify priorities, which will then sort of translate into a regional vision for our transit system and set up the supporting strategies to help us achieve it. And all based in the financial realities I just mentioned. The input and engagement track, a third, but I think to some extent our more important track, will transparently inform the interested parties and help us create opportunities for dialogue. And I'm really hoping for more dialogue than we've ever been able to engage before. There's so many unknowns right now, and that is really why this broad and comprehensive engagement is really so essential. So I'm thrilled to begin this first public forum for our strategic plan that, you know, can help bring together these three thinkers with what I think are very different vantage points to discuss the transit landscape as they see it specifically today. And to lead that discussion, I am very pleased to introduce Jessica Hector-Sue. Jessica is our Director of Planning and Market Development at the RTA, where she has led planning efforts for 7 years. If you paid attention to Tina's intro of me, I brought Jessica in as I was kind of moving into my new role. So she took the baton and ran with it far further, and I think in many ways far better than I ever would. Jessica is an engineer by trade, but a big thinker and I think a real visionary for us. She came to the Chicago region from Boston, where she had worked previously in the consulting space, which really gave her some very diverse and interesting opportunities and a variety of roles, really leading transportation and transit policy development. So I'm personally going to switch off my camera and listen as I look forward to this conversation. And now I'll turn it over to Jessica. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. Thanks so much for those kind words and for introducing me. It's been a lot of fun working here in Chicago with Leanne and the team here after working on the East Coast for a while. So thank you so much. I want to add my thanks to UIC for having us, and thank you for the audience for joining us. You know, you're taking your lunchtime to sit down with us and talk, and that's really what I'm hoping we'll do, is just have a conversation. We have 3 great panelists with us, none of whom work for transit agencies, but all of whom work with transit agencies. And they're going to help us reflect a bit, reflect on the disruption that has been COVID, the lessons that we can take forward with us, and the ways that we might need to think about change. And I'm hoping that I'll learn from this conversation as a staff member at RTA, thinking about how to focus our strategic plan next year. And I'm hoping you as the audience will learn, that you'll walk away just with one thought about something you hadn't thought about, an idea maybe that you hadn't had before, and that you can bring that forward in the discussion we'll all be having over the next few months about what's ahead for transit. So that's what we're going to do today. I will start with some questions for the panelists, and then I'm going to open it up for some audience questions. So start thinking about those and get ready to put those in the chat. And if while we're talking, you have some thoughts or ideas or questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We have staff who are monitoring it and can engage with you there as well. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce my panelists. Panelists, if you want to turn your cameras on and maybe give a friendly wave while I'm introducing you, that'd be great. We have with us today David Bragdon, the Executive Director of the Transit Center based in New York and working across the country. We also have Heidi Prasad, the Director of Transportation Equity for the Center for Neighborhood Technology, CNT, based here in Chicago. We also have Bethany Williams, the Strategy and Intelligence Director for Lake County Partners, also based here in Chicagoland in one of our suburban areas. And panelists, I'm going to start just by asking you to tell us a bit about your work and how you interact with the transit systems just as a part of your regular day-to-day job. I'll go ahead and start with Bethany, and then we'll do Heidi and David. So Bethany, tell us about yourself.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me, and thanks to UTC at UIC and to RTA. It's great to be with you today. My name's Bethany Williams, and I work for Lake County Partners for the Economic Development Agency for Lake County. So we're a suburban economic development organization. And I think historically, most people viewed us as the people who are out trying to get companies to relocate to Lake County or to try and help them grow in Lake County. And that's definitely part of our business. But more and more, even pre-pandemic, as we talked to employers, what we found is as the labor market tightened and the talent race got hot, we started more and more having conversations that involved transit agencies and our transit partners. Everyone from Metro, we started as sort of a groundbreaking reverse commute pilot project in Lake County with some public-private funding models, to paratransit and how that serves people with disabilities or older members of our community. And those folks are part of our workforce. So it's a little bit of everything. And our job is really to try and work with whatever partners we can to solve those problems. And transit's a huge economic tool for us in the suburbs.
Thanks, Bethany. Heidi, tell us about yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, RTA, for the invitation. And I want to also say thank you to all the veterans that have served. Thanks for being with us today. My name is Heidi Prasad, and I'm the Director of Transportation Equity at Center for Neighborhood Technology. And some of the work that I do at CNT is really serving as like a planner or advisor on various transportation and planning projects throughout the region and even nationally. But what I want to focus on today really is my role with helping manage our region's first transportation equity network, which I'll refer to as 10, just to keep it short moving forward. So 10, if you haven't heard of our group yet, is a coalition of community groups, equitable transportation advocates, civic organizations, and other stakeholders in Chicago, many of which are here. Hi, thank you for coming. That work with decision makers to embed racial equity and mobility justice into transportation plans and projects. And one of the things that we do with all that is we try to address some of the inequitable transportation access issues that have been going on in the region, and also negative decisions that have impacted more of our vulnerable communities. And one side note, which I'd like to get into a little bit more later when I have some more time, is that the Center for Neighborhood Technology compensates all of our community-based organizations for their participation in this work, which we think will be one of the issues that will really help transform the transit system moving forward. And so I know that question will come up later, but I do want to just make sure I bring that front and center from the start. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi, for all of that. David, tell us about your work.
Great. Well, thanks, Jessica. Transit Center is a civic foundation. Greetings from New York. We're dedicated to improving cities through better public transportation, particularly in ways that grow ridership and really make cities more sustainable and just. You had asked, how do we interact with transit agencies? And for us, it really takes two forms, outside and inside, kind of an outside-inside game. The first is through supporting community-based advocacy that represents riders' interests. Often they've been left out of the power structure in our society, often on racial lines, gender lines, other unjust distinctions like that. And so we work with community-based organizations to raise up their voices with transit agencies and do advocacy. And so in your area, the Active Transportation Alliance is a great partner of ours. And so is, lo and behold, the Center for Neighborhood Technology and the work that Heidi does, that she just referred to, the Transportation Equity Network. That's an example of the sort of thing that we support in terms of that outside advocacy and activism that tries to influence transit agencies from the outside. But the second dimension of our work is to work directly with transit agencies on policy and practice in terms of improving performance and working hand in hand with staff members, key staff members. And an example of that in your area, we also intersect with Center for Neighborhood Technology in that realm as well. We're kind of mirror images in the sense of both being interested in community-based activism as well as good policy work. So an example in your area is working with the CTA on instilling some measures of equitable access and equitable practices in the operations of the CTA. We do that in other cities as well. I mentioned that just because it's Chicago. We've also done work on governance. Speaking to a group of RTA, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of our works 5-6 years ago was a work called Getting to the Root of It. This was at the time that there was discussion in Springfield about how the RTA, CTA, PACE, Metra do or don't work together under that RTA umbrella. So I think that's kind of an evergreen story. So even if that is an old report, there may still be lessons that are still in existence today about governance in your region. So anyway, that's an introduction to me and to Transit Center and the work that we do.
Thanks for that, David. So I want to pose this next question to all of you. So how have the last 20 months changed the way that you think about the role of transit in the communities in which you work? Bethany got at this a little bit, but I want to give you all a chance to speak to it, and Bethany to expound upon her thoughts a little bit on that. We've seen a pandemic, obviously, we've seen massive social justice movements, we've seen major weather events and renewed interest in concerns about climate change. How have all of these things changed the way that people you and the people with whom you work think about transit?
I can jump in if you'd like. I think for us, the one thing I'll say is I'm sort of the suburban voice on the panel today, but the thing I think most people sometimes forget about the suburbs is that we're a lot more diverse than people think, and even the communities within the suburbs have very different understandings and experiences through the pandemic, right? So Lake County on average, has a certain profile that certain people look at us. But if you look across the different communities in Lake County, you hear very different stories about the way that the pandemic landed on them, very different stories about the way that the social justice experiences of the last, the awakenings around social justice have or haven't happened in different communities across the suburbs. And I think even awareness and interest and a sense of action are in response to climate events and weather events have landed differently across the suburbs. So without sort of throwing a uniform reaction to it, one exercise that we've been going through over the last year is a comprehensive economic development strategy update for our county. And that's a federal process under the Economic Development Administration to lay a roadmap for the next 5 years for economic development. And what it involves is a lot of conversations with a lot of stakeholders. And for the first time, I think what we're seeing is, instead of thinking about, okay, well, we have a big biopharma cluster up here, how do we think about that? We're really kind of hitting into a lot of the intersectional policy issues that drive overall community health, not just economic health, but the healthy social fabric, and all of these things like transit, housing, educational equity. All of these things are coming across. The pandemic sort of illuminated a lot of the cracks and fissures that were there already and exacerbated them. And I'm seeing a lot more interest and awareness in kind of unraveling these public policy hairballs that sort of tend to reinforce themselves unless you really kind of look at intersectional solutions to some of these problems. So it's, I don't think we're done yet. Obviously, these issues haven't settled out. The pandemic isn't over. But there's been a lot of sort of change in perspective, which I think is really exciting and healthy, at least from where we're sitting up here in Lake County.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's interesting that you point out that there hasn't necessarily been a change, but what happened is we've all noticed the cracks, the fissures that were there before are now illuminated, and we can all start to see them anew. David and Heidi, do either of you want to jump in and speak to that question that I had asked?
I think what you just said is about what I was going to say. It's just the semantic. I think you originally posted is how events the last 2 years changed our views of transit. I think for us, it's more a matter of that it's sharpened our views about it, maybe deepened our views about things that we instinctively knew, or that people in the vanguard sort of knew, but that were not, a matter of general awareness. And so some of those prescriptions that we see now is really coming to the fore were things that we would have advocated before. One is basically our premise is that transit's utility is based on its usefulness to people, particularly to people who need and use it the most. And that the focus of our planning and investment, which has been inequitable in the past and continues to be inequitable, needs to be refocused to really serve the goal of increasing equitable access and driving greenhouse gas emissions down. And the way you do both of those things is through ridership, and the way you get ridership is through the usefulness of the service, which has really some fundamental key elements like frequency, like putting the service where people are going to use it, like walkability, like connecting it to land use, to the hours of the day in which it is operating, kind of the long-term migration from a 9 to 5 mentality, or the idea that our transportation system should be designed and sized and operated in order to meet those peaks at 9 in the morning or 5 in the afternoon, which was a vastly outmoded assumption even before the pandemic. During the pandemic, it became totally irrelevant. And so again, that just sort of sharpened and deepened the focus on those. So I think all of those things, and the service that was being provided to essential workers made transit itself essential. I think the Rocky, the president of Metro, was just quoted earlier in this program about heroes carrying heroes, but it's really, essential workers carrying other essential workers.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. Heidi, thank you. Yes, it would be great if all the audience members could keep yourselves muted and off camera. Heidi, do you want to speak to that question as well?
Yeah, I agree with Bethany and David with many of their remarks. And while we have seen some changes, particularly, I think, in our region, city and suburbs included, with how transit, I think, was primarily more focused on commuters, maybe coming into the downtown or other large employment centers that were accessible by transit. It's sort of shifted more to riders trying to access basic needs, whether it's going to the grocery store or their jobs that are not necessarily in the loop, medical centers. And many of them were not traveling to the loop. They were going to more dispersed areas in the region. So maybe they were commuting within their neighborhoods or out to the suburbs. And so there has been that shift that I think has made the conversation about partnering and talking with our more disadvantaged communities so much more heightened. One thing that hasn't changed has been the disadvantage, the inequities within the transit system. They were always there before. I think they were highlighted during the pandemic, worsened during the pandemic. And what the pandemic, I think, allowed us to do was, because of the social justice movements and, of course, advocacy on behalf of advocates and nonprofits for years that leading up to it, I think finally just sort of merged, and we had an opportunity for a lot of these groups to come to the table and to be involved with decision makers, to be involved in planning processes that impact their neighborhoods, when everyone was trying to figure out what to do and how to best serve those that were most vulnerable and still using transit services. And some of the examples that I have that I didn't get a chance to mention before that I would love to share is that in these last 20 months, the Transportation Equity Network actually kind of jump-started right around the time that the pandemic started. And we are not short of being busy. If nothing else, we've expanded as a group, not just in the city, but regionally. And our work with multiple agencies have, I think, led to wonderful changes that hopefully will be implemented to better serve those communities that depend on public transit and will continue to depend on it moving forward, since work from home may not necessarily be something that is something that they can necessarily do. So we've worked with the Chicago Department of Transportation on their strategic plan, which was released just a few months ago. We are working with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. I'm spelling it out so I don't get too acronym-ish here. On their mobility recovery plan and equitable engagement program. We're working with Cook County on both their transit and bike plan. We helped advise Elevated Chicago and DPD on their ETOD policy plan. So that's just to name a few. Really busy. Everyone wants to hear from the Transportation Equity Network because they are representing those voices of those that are most vulnerable. They understand their communities and they're able to come back to the table sustainably and long-term to discuss the work that they've already been doing and where they think it is that we need to go moving forward.
Thanks for that. You know, it's interesting, Bethany, you said, you know, things haven't really changed. We see them anew. And David, you said even some of the solutions haven't really changed. Like the things that we were thinking about before, we probably need to lean into now. And Heidi, you took that a little bit further and said the solutions are some of the same, but a lot of the voices that we weren't listening to before, they've been there. We haven't heard them. Now they're at the table and we're listening. So do you think that we're at a moment right now, an important moment where maybe people and agencies are willing to take some risks? Have any of you been seeing that where maybe everyone's willing to try some new things we haven't tried before?
I mean, from our perspective, yes, I hope so. It's interesting that some of the stuff that we were working on before the pandemic is stuff that was, well, Jessica, we met, I think, because we were working on the paratransit issue in Lake County. Lake County didn't have a universal paratransit system. We have lots of patchwork small systems, but we didn't have a countywide program. For the first time ever, we're launching a countywide program because it broadens access and delivers more equitable service to everyone in the county. That was work that started before the pandemic, but the pandemic made it more important than ever. We've seen employers act in new ways. And that's, I think, maybe something I'd like to highlight is, anytime you're dealing with transit, it's very hard to take things away, things that have existed for a long time. It gets very hard to change them. I remember, working with Metra, I was surprised to learn that some of the Metra schedule is older than I am in Lake County and was built back in the day when the system existed to get workers from bedroom communities in Lake County, downtown Chicago to office jobs. And the reality when we looked at the data before the pandemic was that for every 4 riders that were going from Lake County into Cook County and Chicago in the AM peak, there were 3 that were riding the train backwards, but the schedule was really still designed to shove people into Chicago all the time. So we were having these kinds of, and that sort of led to this pilot project that we were able to do and to build some reverse commute service because it turns out train tracks run 2 ways. And that was exciting to see employers kind of push that change forward. And so I think what's interesting about this moment, we talked about sort of the collision of the social justice movements and really important kind of climate stuff going on, the pandemic hitting at the same time. All of that also has this incredibly huge impact on the workforce as individuals. And I think a lot of people are having these moments of like, do I want to live in a car for 2 hours a day? Do I want to commute? Do I, what is my life? We're all having these existential crises as we sit in our kitchen offices of like, what do I want my life to be like after this? If we don't learn anything, even as human individuals, what was the point? And so I think there's this moment where we can leverage opportunities that people are thinking of, their whole operation, their whole, as an organization, as a government entity, as a transit agency, as a large employer, as a tiny municipality, and also at the human level, at the individual level, to really rethink, like, how do I come back from this in a different way? And I don't think I've ever seen, at least in my career, in my lifetime, a moment like that where people are having this reckoning. And it seems, I hope we don't miss it. I hope this is a moment. I think we really wanted a moment before. I'm sad that it's taken all of this to get a moment, but I really hope that we grab it now that it's here.
Thanks, Bethany, for sharing all of that. David or Heidi, do you want to weigh in on this one too?
Heidi, you go first.
Are
And
we
I'll
at a
follow,
moment?
I'll follow Heidi this time. on
Yeah.
this.
Okay, sounds good. Heidi, yeah, tell us your thoughts on that one.
Bethany, I think you kind of just hit it on the mark, but I heard something at Revolution a couple months ago where it's like, now is the season to be bold. Now is the time when compassion and care are most important. And I think that really is just where we need to be. It's the time to not be scared of change. Clearly, everything is going to change. It already has changed. And so we need to just kind of keep riding the momentum, and while trying to think of new and innovative ways to move forward, it's just, I can't emphasize enough to just remember that there's already a lot of groundwork that has been laid. There's already a lot of people that have been trying to come to the table to help address these issues in a collaborative manner, and that we make sure that we don't lose any of those instances while we're kind of trying to solve where it is that we go next. That's where the answer lies. And so those conversations need to be prioritized. And again, the implementation, the work needs to be there. It can't just be conversations. In fact, many times when you talk to a lot of community-based organizations, they tell you, I've already said this isn't new. And so the question is, what are we doing? When does the rubber meet the road? Where is the investment coming from? Is the political will there? What is it that we need to see change in our communities so that we're seeing more equitable outcomes that are all directly related to improving the transit system?
Yeah, Heidi, I'm going to ask you just to elaborate a little bit more on that. David, we'll come to you in a second, but tell us what it looks like for an agency to listen and be willing to take some risks based on what they're hearing from a community group. Like, talk a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Sure. So I've worked as a planner for many years prior to my role at CNT. And so, I think that a lot of times when agencies or planners, when we conduct outreach, it could be a little bit difficult I used the word sustainable earlier. Maybe I want to say it's more like sustainable outreach. You may hear once or twice in a public meeting what the issues are, but you don't always necessarily get to the answer. You don't have ongoing conversations. Some of these people are not coming back to the table when it comes time to implement and to move projects forward. When we're working with communities, I think that there needs to be an emphasis and there needs to be prioritization around not just listening the first time, not just sitting there and saying, okay, great feedback, but then taking the next steps forward, being held accountable on what we say we're going to do, ensuring that there are sustained partnerships moving forward. So in case somebody, like me, is not there to help facilitate the conversations, that there's relationship building happening so that organizations and transit agencies can communicate and continue to build and improve together. I think there needs to be much more transparent partnership and relationship that hasn't been there before. And it's just crucial when everyone is putting out statements and saying, we believe in equity, we care about all of the systemic racism and all of these big claims. You kind of, as I mentioned before, you put the rubber to the road, you meet people where they need to be, and you help advance some of those recommendations that are being given in those meetings. I guess a more concrete example, Jessica, we worked with the Chicago Department of Transportation on the strategic plan, which David, I believe, Transit Center provided some grants funding for. And part of it was compensating our organizations for even participating. We're working with local nonprofits that have full-time jobs that are probably much more busy than anyone can imagine. And taking away their time to come and provide feedback to a plan should not be done without compensation. Any consultant wouldn't do it. We do it maybe because our agencies have, like the overall funding for us to be able to participate in different things. But when it comes to these like more grassroots organizations, you need to be able to compensate their participation That's number one. And then number two, you keep them coming back and, following up on whatever recommendations. And so we did that with CDOT. They were all involved in the strategic planning process, and now will be involved in the implementation of the strategic plan and the capital plan, which to me is, like step one in implementation. And hopefully it'll, also turn into just more relationship building moving forward.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks for all of that. If we have time, I might come back to that a little bit more, and we can talk about engagement with you and with the other folks. But I want to give David a chance to speak to the moment we're in right now and to risk taking on the agency side.
Yeah, sure. In terms of, agency responses across the nation really have varied tremendously and are a matter of leadership. I mean, this is a time when leadership really does matter, and the responsiveness and ability to be nimble tracks with that. So, Dorval Carter and the crew at CTA was like, if depth of the pandemic is like, hey, we're going to put the service out there on the street. We are needed. It's kind of in the DNA of the place, right? City of broad shoulders, and this is what we do. New York's MTA similar. It's like we've been through 9/11, we've been through floods, we've been through black. We're going to keep putting that service out there on the street. Other places kind of packed up a little bit. BART stopped running it, in the mid-evening. Other places really sort of, abandoned customers. And it's a matter of kind of commitment and leadership. In terms of service patterns, there were some, I think, very nimble. San Francisco Muni is a good example. Limited resources, labor constraints, fiscal concerns before the federal action. And they did basically a route network redesign sort of thing that would normally take years. They did it quickly and explained it well to people and said, you know what, these neighborhoods where you're all white, I should say white collar, they're probably in San Francisco, they're like, t-shirts and hoodies, but they're the people making $300,000 a year, what I'm talking about. You're working at home in your laptop. Guess what? We are going to not have buses in your neighborhood for the next 60 days. And we are going to double the frequency in the parts of town where the essential workers need it. And that's how we're doing it. And that's why we're doing it. The public really broadly accepted it. Muni was also flexible. And this is maybe a cultural of collaboration, of saying, for years, Golden Gate buses have been running down the street, and AC Transit comes across from Oakland, and they run on San Francisco streets as part of their route, but they can't pick up and take anybody down because, sometime right around 1849, they all made an agreement that they couldn't do that. And they said, you know what, we're gonna do that now. And so it was, enforced. It created some cooperation in the mutual aid. And I think also the other thing that happened that is dependent on the place and the leadership, and not just the leadership, but the whole culture, is labor relations. And when when it suddenly became a matter of life and death, and Pittsburgh would be an example of this, where they realized, wow, we're having spread in the bullpen where the drivers are checking in for their runs because they're standing 2 feet in front of a dispatcher getting their pouch, and we need to reorient this whole building and the check-in process. And the union, the local president and the CEO of the transit agency said, okay, normally this would take like 2 years and an 83-page amendment to our collective bargaining agreement to change this process. But, we need to change it now. We need to get the, and so they just on a handshake said, okay, we're going to do things differently. And so, if that kind of spirit can carry through when it's not a matter of life and death, and a more collaborative relationship between management and the workforce is something that I think everybody would agree would be desirable in this industry where it's typically been an adversarial sort of thing. That would be a good thing to emulate coming out of this. So, yeah, I think some agencies have responded better than others, and now we got to see kind of if that sort of approach continues into the coming years.
Yeah, thanks for all that and all those perspectives across the country. So before we go to audience questions, I just want to ask one last question and ask you all to just, if you had to give us as staff working on the strategic plan and the folks in the audience sort of one piece of advice on a change that the transit system should be thinking about right now, among the things you've mentioned or something else, what would it be? Jump in if you have a thought.
I think it's a good time to approach planning with humility and openness, and that I can't remember, nobody knows anything right now. And I spent 12 years with the MPO, and I was president of the Metro Council out in Portland, Oregon. And I know the planning culture is, it's a lot of calculations and forecasts. And I think that this is probably a moment to be humble about what we do or don't know, and to try to sort of maximize sort of the way we're going, while being true to some principles, particularly with regard to service and providing service equitably to people who need and use it the most, and really centering that. I would also say often, long-term plans are very focused on capital and are on expansion, and that it's always good practice, I think, to also keep operations and maintenance of the stuff we have in mind.
Thank you. Bethany, do you want to give that question a shot?
Sure. I think from our perspective, it's going to be, it's a good moment to think about who are maybe some non-traditional partners who can provide some insight and some thought in this process. I think people are willing to sit down and come to the table in ways that they haven't before, even in terms of, in our case, it was private employers funding public transit service in Lake County, and that's a big deal. But people are willing to get creative to solve challenges in ways that we haven't seen before, and so I think that's a big thing. And I think the other piece of this is when we really think back across user experiences, and it's funny, David, that you mentioned the Bay Area. That's where I lived before moving to Chicagoland 11 years ago. And I think they have something like 86 transit agencies across it's just insane. I used to ride a ferry to work. It's every mode you can imagine, right? But as a user, you don't care whose bus you're on or whose train you're on. You care to be able to get where you need to go when you need to get there in ways that are reliable and safe and easily accessible. And so to make sure we're taking this time to think about things truly from the user's perspective, because some of the technical glitches, or the way that we've done things, or the way that things have been siloed or divided, or the buckets we put things in, don't matter on the user side. And so we have to put ourselves on that side of the equation more often.
Okay, good. Thanks for that advice too. Heidi, what about you? Advice for agencies into the transit system specifically?
Right. So we know that people's use of transit is based on their demographics, their income, or their different needs to travel. So transit agencies now should be considering responding to who's using their system today. There has been a shift, and I think that needs to be prioritized. And that is, I think, one that we're seeing is those that have always depended on public transit continue to ride it during the pandemic and will continue to ride it in the future. And so transit agencies need to improve their communication and relationships with these communities. And while it is definitely not a replacement for traditional outreach, I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying that. It is critical, I think, for partnering with community-based organizations throughout the region to develop plans and implement projects as they can really be sort of the stronghold needed in the community to get things going.
All right, thanks for that. Thank you again for all those thoughts. So I'm going to go ahead and take some audience questions. So if those of you in the audience, go ahead and put some questions in the chat. We have a couple already lined up, so I'm just going to dive right in. The first question is actually about the distribution of jobs and of housing, and how and whether those two things are connected, or whether this is an opportunity for us to revisit that question about the connection or disconnect between where the jobs are and where the people are. Do any of you want to speak to that?
It's something we pay attention to a lot out in Lake County. We like to talk about that we have the highest live and work rate of any of the suburban counties in the Chicagoland area, meaning that the highest percentage of people, not leaving our home county to go find jobs. We want people to be able to live their whole life here. We love Chicago. You're great. You're the reason we're here, but we don't all have to commute downtown every day. And so that's something we pay a lot of attention to. I think one of the things that we're starting to look at too for us, just from a holistic standpoint, as we're making investments in things like sewer lines, I mean, things as mundane as, where we're, adding, basic infrastructure stuff. How are we, how are we kind of pushing or encouraging maybe the communities in our county to think about, other things beyond we need sewer service here, is what else does that unlock? And so, and are we leveraging investments like that? We don't need to build new bus lines to support retail corridors in communities where no one who makes money at a retail job could afford to work. That's not a wise investment of public funds. So how are we tying all of these kinds of investments together to make sure that we're not building ourselves, that we're maximizing the impact of every kind of infrastructure dollar, transit or otherwise?
Interesting. Thanks for that, Bethany. So you're thinking about it in the suburbs and thinking about how you can create space for people to live and work where they are, and maybe addressing some of that historic expectation that people are going to be going downtown. What about you, Heidi? Since you're working in a city, do you feel like that job housing disconnect in the opposite direction is something that you think could or should change, or people are talking about that right now?
Yeah, I think firstly, there's the conversation around, and I think very important to this, the conversation around housing and jobs near transit stations are usually, they usually have much more amenities, and there's more of a desire to live in those areas, I think not just in the city, but in the suburbs as well. And so they easily become unaffordable. And so, I think first things first, there needs to be a lot more conversations around those equitable transit-oriented development conversations that are going on right now. But in terms of jobs and housing, one of the interesting conversations that our 10 group had with CMAP recently was about whether or not access to the loop was really going to impact the majority of their workers when they weren't going to the loop to begin with. And so really it's looking at making a more comprehensive transit service to get you to all the different areas in the region to where their work is, or even making sure that there is more employment closer to home so that there isn't so much of a dependency to come into the loop. And so I think that's something that's still sort of developing. And I've heard a couple of comments here and there regarding like where should jobs be located and the access to them. But what we do know is that many are not in the loop. They could be out in the suburbs, or they could be in, some manufacturing centers that are further out, and access to those are already, not great. And so, again, I think these are ongoing issues that haven't changed and need to just sort of be revisited and explored further with these communities.
I think you have some historical patterns and some institutional barriers, particular to your area. You have some other advantages too, but before the pandemic, that I think just by national standards, that the Chicago area tends to have a higher degree of job sprawl than other places, and higher degree of segregation on racial lines than a lot of places. And then when you overlay that with a transportation governance system where some of the neighborhoods where people need the jobs the most in the south side of Chicago are served by one agency, the CTA, and the available jobs are served by PACE or Metra, that the ability to connect those trips becomes really important. I think you can look at since there are different operators. I mean, compared to a place like Houston, Houston's very multi-centric, in the sense that downtown Houston is not a huge percentage of the employment, but there's other medical centers that correlate to universities, 4 or 5 different ones. And so with one agency, they're able to deploy their transit service in that sort of multi-nodal way rather than sort of hub and spoke, particularly on the bus side, being more responsive to connecting those things. in terms of housing and jobs.
Interesting. Got it. Yeah. So we're nearing the end of our time, but I want to take one more audience question and throw it back to you all for maybe just a quick answer before I hand it back to Tina. The second question is about essentially about fares, and about that the person references the fare pilot going on a couple of the metro lines of the South Side, and the person's asking whether those financial incentives from fares are enough to encourage people to ride transit again, especially if they haven't been riding for a while or they're concerned about transit. What do you guys think? Do you think that that fares are something that would really bring people back, or if it's not fares, something else that might encourage people to come back to transit?
Our research is that fares are not enough. Fares are often not, excluding the discussion of commuter rail, I'll get to that in a second, but generally on most bus and subway systems, the fare is not the most important obstacle for most people. It is an obstacle for some people that should receive targeted, means-tested discounts for people who need it, but that in terms of getting people back, it's really the service, it's the frequency and the reliability. Then specific though to you, what you're talking about, the experiments on the South Side, which we really applaud, is having some parity of fares between the metro lines, the old Illinois Central, and the red line, CTA, that it shouldn't, you know, a person shouldn't have to choose, well, I'm going to spend an hour and a half on a bus when a train is going right by here on its way from Blue Island or where it's coming from, and it's just speeding by, and I could get to LaSalle Street in 12 minutes on that, but I would have to pay 5 times the price. That's not right. So I think trying to make better use of that existing infrastructure. But again, the fare is only part of the picture. If the train doesn't stop, and if it only runs every 2 hours, the fare doesn't matter. So it's got to be all of those things.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that yes, while fare may not be the answer for the general population, to quote Access Living, Laura Saltzman, if she's here, she mentioned that sometimes those that probably could most use fare free are not coming to the table and are not advocating for themselves. So we need to be a little bit careful sometimes with those that say, like, you know, service is more important than fares, which I think, you know, we've seen it before, and I think is something that totally makes sense. But there are those that probably really need fare free, and I think that the pilot, the Metro pilot, is a really good thing. I've only heard good comments, and I think others would like to see it expanded to other areas in the region. And so I think if anyone were to be fare free, you know, we'd have to prioritize low income people to find a way for either, as David mentioned, either if it's not a discount, to just be completely free for them, since they will continue to use the service, not necessarily looking at it from just like an overall ridership question, but specifically focusing on our more vulnerable communities.
Thanks for coming at that one with a different angle, Heidi. Bethany, do you want to add anything on that last question?
No, I think that's our great points. And I think, you know, part of it too, just from where we sit, is about building that culture of transit ridership too, which has both issues to do with fare and with the reliability and the frequency of service. Particularly, you know, when we saw service cuts in the suburbs, we're concerned about that, losing that culture, whatever culture of ridership that we may have had. And so that's we're concerned on both sides.
Yeah, good. I like that, culture of ridership. That's a neat phrase. So that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you all so much. This was all really interesting. I definitely learned a lot, and really appreciated hearing your perspectives. To the audience, make sure to pay attention to the strategic planning process that we're doing. Sign up for our newsletter, watch us on social media. We'll be listening throughout the fall and actually doing the strategic planning itself next spring. So pay attention. We have an RFI out right now to look at access by transit. So check that out as well. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to Tina to close us out.
Thanks, Jessica. I want to echo your thanks to the panel. That was awesome. I was in between some goosebumps and kind of teary moments there, but that's because I'm a big transit nerd. If you had an aha moment or had something that came up in the conversation, throw it in the chat. We really want to know what you found interesting about this conversation. And we will follow up with an email with a link to a survey that we're doing to get more input. And this is just the beginning of the conversation that we'll be having with you and hopefully many more across the region as we create our strategic plan. So thank you so much for joining us. And look for our email with more information about staying engaged. And thanks again to everybody, especially UTC. Thanks to UTC.